Welcome back. In this video, I'm going to be discussing an interesting article written by Howard Gardner. And you may already know that Howard Gardner is the John H. and Elisabeth A. Hobbs Research Professor of Cognition and Education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. He's the author of, 30 books translated into 32 languages and several hundred articles. Is the best known in educational circle for his theory of multiples intelligences, a critique of the notion that there is just one single human intelligence that can be assessed by standard psychometric instrument. Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences was published in 1983, and in a book, Frames of a Mind, he proposes that intelligence is not a single ability but a complex collection of distinct mental capacity, challenging the traditional IQ-based view of intelligence. The theory identifies several specific types of intelligence, including linguistic, logical, mathematical, spatial, musical, bodily kinesthetic, interpersonal, intrapersonal, and naturalistic. The article that I'd like to share today with you is some initial thoughts about wisdom. Syntheses, some initial thoughts about wisdom. In scholarship, as in other spheres, one thing often leads to another, by a path I might not have anticipated, as I found myself clearly launched in my 90th decade. I have been pondering what it means to be wise. Here is the unexpected sequence. My challenge to unitary singular psychological concept of mind led to the theory of multiple intelligences. Along with the scholarly book that has long been my major claim to fame, Frames of a Mind, published in 1983. My writing about intelligence led to questions about creativity and eventually to 7 case studies, each putatively related to one of intelligences in creating minds, published in 1993. On the heels of studying creativity, an invitation to write about leadership, simulated and comparable examination of several leading minds, and indeed I eventually came to see creativity as a form of indirect leadership. Question about the constructive as contrasted with destructive manifestation of intelligences, creativity, leadership, prompt me to ponder the realm of morality and ethics and to fruitful collaboration on good work in 2001. The launching and pursuit of the Good Work Project, now the Good Project, into philosophical reflection about truth, beauty, and goodness, reframed in 2011. When as I neared my 90th decade, I undertook a scholarly autobiography I realized that my own mind could not be described in an illuminating way by my theory. Rather, I was and am better described and having a synthesizing mind in 2020. And then, a complete surprise, I became and remain obsessed with the nature and component of synthesizing, both because synthesizing turns out to be a credible description of my own talents, such as they are, and because the nature and nurture of the human synthesizes competence has been largely neglected by psychologists and other cognitively oriented scholars. Gradually, I came to realize that, as with intelligences, creativity, and leadership, such integrative capacity are essentially amoral. One can deploy each of all of these capacity for neutral, benign, or malignant purposes. Both propagandists, for instance, Joseph Goebbels, and literary giant Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, were masters of the German language. Political leaders like Nelson Mandela and Slobodan Milosevic each manifested considerable interpersonal intelligence, but, as suggested by these contrasting cases, comparable talents can be mobilized for quite different ends. No surprise that synthesizing can also be mobilized in different ways for disparate purposes. According to psychoanalyst Erik Erikson, Mahatma Gandhi analyzed the psyche of the Indian populace and thereupon devised his vision and his methods of a peaceful resistance. And so, as a current leader, Nelson Mandela, uh, Narendra Modi, who indeed himself seeks to replace Gandhi in the pantheon of esteemed Indian leaders of the last century. I have kept that less positive uses ought to be labeled as syntheses, and the first three letters are capital letter, so sin, which means, something not so good. I can't help quipping further that Donald Trump has identified several of less appealing contemporary American attitudes and aspiration and has produced an effective synthesis, though they are unlikely to be reading these words. Supporter of President Trump could claim that his synthesis is brilliant, timely, needed, and morally justifiable, which by circuitous route brings me to the topic of this block. Wisdom, first thoughts, a preliminary definition. Wisdom is a form of a synthesis that extends over time, building on the past, analyzing the present, anticipating and perhaps trying to affect the future. Wisdom embeds and foregrounds specific moral and ethical value, seeking to embody and extend those values while sloughing off or minimizing competing ones. Wisdom is modest, not claiming omniscience. Tentative, not claiming longevity, but it can be, and sometimes is courageous. Wise individuals are prepared to stand their ground and poised to deal with criticism. while neither restricted to nor guaranteed by age, wisdom is more likely to emerge as a result of a lifetime observation, learning, and reflection, rather than as a sudden flash of insight or insight. An intriguing example from recent American history. After World War II, a small group of Americans played an inordinately significant role in creation and execution of policy, particularly foreign policy. Coming largely from privileged backgrounds, highly educated, having lived through the Second World War, indeed spanning its antecedents as well as its sequelae. This person generally shunned the limelight, and yet, while working behind the scenes, they were instrumental in making consequential decisions, and at least for the time, the decisions were often on target. Among more familiar names, Secretary State Dean Acheson, scholar of Russia and the Soviet Union, George Kennan, roving ambassadors Charles Bohlen and Averil Harriman. In a timely and well-titled volume, The Wise Man, published in 1986, journalists Walter Isaacson and Ivan Thomas documented the lives of the achievement of this remarkable group, and in an afterword published in 2012, the authors speculate about why such a set of quiet but powerful influencers is unlikely to arise again, and at least so far the vastly different culture, socio-political, and epistemological milieu of the 21st century support the author speculation. Over a decade before the publication of the Wise Man, journalist David Halberstam had published an equal timely and important book, The Best and the Brightest, in 1972. In his account of the launch and pursuit of the ill-advised Vietnam War, Halberstam homes on a somewhat younger group, in some cases proteges of the Wise Man in the early 1960s, upon the launch of the Kennedy administration. These policymakers, I lost my way. Okay, these policymakers, some from highly privileged background, had descended on Washington and soon launched and pursued the Vietnam War. Despite being deemed the best and the brightest, they orchestrated the military fiasco which they proved unable to stanch and which still haunts many policymakers. An interesting footnote to this tale of two books, one pertinent to the topic of this essay. In 1967, sitting President Lyndon Johnson invited a dozen of the original Wise Men to the White House to consult about the future course of the Vietnam War. Then, at a stalemate, after speaking with them, Johnson allegedly quipped, "A great group. I wish I had had them when they were 20 years younger." Echoing this sentiment, Dean Atkinson, perhaps the doyen of the original Wise Men, reflected, "We can no longer do the job we set out to do in the time we have left, and we must begin to take steps to disengage." Literally, He may have been talking about prosecuting the war, but I sense that he was reflecting as well on what it means to grow old and contemplate an ever diminished ambit. At last, by circuitous route, a brief definition. Sorry. Wisdom encompasses knowledge, judgment, and action. The wise person takes into account all relevant factors and considerations, weighs their relative importance in the current and reasonably feasible context, arrives at a decision, a recommendation of a course of action, one which seems feasible and defensible, elects whether, and if so, how to effect that decision or recommendation. Assuming goal, the wise person marshals the courage to execute the decide upon course of action, monitors the immediate and longer term effect of the intervention, positive, negative, too soon to tell, and then carefully considers where to intervene again, and if so, in what manner. Relevant factors. Knowledge. Needless to say, one cannot be wise unless one identifies and is knowledgeable about the relevant factors and discriminates from factors that are no longer relevant. And in that knowledge needs to encompass not only the past but also the current scene as well as likely future factors and probable consequences. Reflection. In most circumstances, the wise person does not leap into action, and in many, perhaps even most situations, the wise person holds back until such a time as the intervention and can reasonably be launched, acted upon, and thereafter reflected on. Intervention. When the time for speech or action is clearly at hand, the wise person acts and does so resolutely. The action recommendation entails no more than is necessary, and in general, in the aftermath, the wise individual remains restrained, likely in the background. But if the intervention proves ineffective or even harmful, the wise person should be held responsible and be prepared to accept the consequences. Moral and ethical facets. In conceptualization, good work, a concern of our research group for 3 decades, 3E. Strengths have proved crucial. Excellence, the work is of a high quality. Engagement, the worker cares about and is involved in the situation. And lastly, an ethics, the worker seeks to follow a course of action that is optimal, moral, defensible, and not self-interested. It is beyond the self, based on a consideration of what is good for the world or the nation or a particular group that is needed and worthy. The consideration and execution of good work should always be in the foreground if one is to invoke the descriptor wise. Good work is essential, indeed quintessential. Consideration of intelligences. With respect to most situations in which wisdom is called for and cherished, the traditional scholastic intelligences, linguistic and logical mathematical, are germane. Equally important are personal intelligences, understanding of others, understanding of self. Possibly at the premium is so-called existential intelligence, the inclination, capacity to reflect on big questions. And of course, when it comes to the particulars of a situation, a conundrum, other intelligences may well assume a role. As an example, in issue of warfare, both spatial and bodily kinesthetic intelligences may prove pertinent, and musical intelligence may even play a role. Age and experience. For most issues and conundrums, wisdom correlates with age and experience. Yet age is certainly not in itself guarantor of wisdom, nor does youth preclude it. Libraries, including religious one, and newsreels, and perhaps news feeds, are replete with account of a young person who thought and acted wisely, as well as account of older person who would have been better off remaining inactive and silent, as implied by the above cited comments of Dean Atkinson and former President Lyndon Johnson. Emotion and personality. In most of the lines, a research that I've undertaken, see the introduction, I've minimized or at least underplayed the roles of personality and emotion. But clearly, once one considers the achievement and possible deployment of wisdom, it's essential to take into account the emotional states of all involved and, as appropriate, the personalities as well. With reference to the individual and groups cited above, a thorough study would encompass these factors. It's hard even to think about Lyndon Johnson without reflecting on his larger-than-life persona. Wisdom and lore. Every language, every literature that I know of plays with the idea of wisdom. Just in English, we have a wise guys, we have a wise acres, we have, wise hammers, wise cracks, conventional wisdom, often used ironically. Wisdom did emerge in adolescence. Note that most of these wordplays are not positive. The road to wisdom may be paved with good intention, but such aspiration alone do not suffice. Sphere and sectors. In the examples cited so far, I have focused on political and military issues, cited individual with relevant knowledge in these domains, but across history and across cultures, wisdom is often applied in personal matters, and it has been manifest by religious leaders, psychotherapists, village elders, and, at least on occasion, magicians or seers. Wisdom is precious, elusive, but also needed, especially in perilous times. I greatly value the wise women and men whom I have been privileged to know, family members, friends, teachers, as well as those whom I only have known by reputation or by their writing. And I hope that at least in a few circumstances I have pursued wise course of action, or spoken wisely, or wisely have remained in the background, and that when foolish in word or deed, I have made amends as best I could. Closing note and apologia. In other life, bearing in mind some of the references below, I might embark on book about wise minds, selecting positive example and perhaps a few false positives would be an intriguing exercise in itself. I am well aware that the topic of wisdom has been of concern of philosophers dating back to Socrates and forward to Robert Nozick, and that in more recent times it has been investigated by psychologists, notably Paul Walters, Robert Stenberg, and their colleagues. A fuller treatment of this topic should be informed by a study of these and other scholars. And this is, let me say, the essay, interesting, very, very interesting, I want to share with you in this video. Thank you so much for watching. See you in the next video. Bye bye.